good morning and welcome to this New York Press Club panel, The Media's Responsibility in Election 2020. I'm Ethan Harp and I'm pleased to be your moderator. We're joined by some of the top names in political journalism in New York City and state. You will find their detailed biographies in your programs. But for now, let's please join me in welcoming Michael Calderone of Politico. He is on Twitter at Michael Calderone. Zach Fink of Spectrum News New York 1. He is on Twitter at Zach Fink News. Harry Siegel of the Daily Beast, the New York Daily News, and the podcast FAQ NYC. He is on Twitter at Harry Siegel. And Ruby Kramer of Buzzfeed News. She is on Twitter at Ruby Kramer. So I will ask a couple of So I'll ask a couple of questions to kick things off, but your questions, of course, are more important. So please begin lining up, and we will come to you as soon as we can. We should have microphones set up out there. A reminder that the views offered today are those solely of the speakers. They do not reflect the views of their employers, or mine for that matter. And so with that, let's begin. We have little choice, ladies and gentlemen, but is the media ready for 2020?
I think you stumped us. I'll start. I think in some ways that the news media is ready. I think fundamentally when you're looking, especially now in a Democratic primary, the role and responsibility of the media is largely similar than it was in past cycles, which is to vet these candidates, to hold them accountable for the things that they say in stump speeches, in the studios, and in interviews. So I think the news media is ready in that sense. I think the curveball in this election, as it was in the 2016 election, is that the attention is constantly diverted to President Trump than Donald Trump. And I think part of the media, what the media needs to be prepared for is to stay focused on the race and maybe not spend 6 days on Sharpiegate, or maybe a little bit less time on some of the things that Donald Trump is saying that are untrue or that are just odd on a daily basis. So I think yes, there are great reporters that are traveling around the country right now, and I think they're doing excellent work trying to take the pulse of the electorate and performing the functions that the news media has in the campaign. I think there is the possible pitfall of being constantly distracted. That doesn't mean ignoring the president. Of course, he's the president. He should be covered all the time, but maybe trying to be mindful of some of these pitfalls.
You want to weigh on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, I don't think that, the idea of whether we're ready or not for something like a general election against Trump as a sitting president with a Democratic nominee whom, we don't know who it is yet. And I don't think that we can be ready for that. We have no idea what that's going to look like. We have no idea how he's going to come after that person, the Democratic nominee, whomever he or she is. As someone who covered Hillary Clinton in 2016, who was running against Trump in the general election, there was no way we were ready for that. And I don't even think at the time we really knew exactly what we were covering, if that makes sense. We were finding ourselves, I was covering Clinton's election, so I was mostly writing stories about her, but there was a point at which in May or June, things really quickly began to shift to, like Michael was saying, a world in which everything was sort of reactive in one way or another to Donald Trump. And I don't think that we actually covered what he was actually saying and how he was resonating with voters as much as we did. Like, what did he say today about David Duke, and how did Hillary Clinton's campaign choose to respond or not? So that's something that I think will kind of have to be shaken into thinking about again pretty soon.
My question here is really ready for what? And I think that's remained very amorphous as people are trying to work out what the role of the press is, and as it's become increasingly responsive to what Donald Trump has sharpied on a map or said about David Duke in a given day. I don't think the role of the press has changed, in my view, at all. I think there's a smaller press corps, both nationally and locally, and it's not doing that as much as it was. A smaller share of it is, which is reporting new and relevant information and framing it in a way that it gets to a larger audience. I think that whole ecosystem has been pretty obviously broken, except for my employers, of course. And You have stories, Trump's taxes is an obvious example. I don't mean to fixate on Trump, but just for a second. You remember that New Yorker story about the Trump kids and the Soho project and Cy Vance not going at them? So at least 3 newsrooms were looking at that backstory here in 2016. And they dropped it for various reasons. I won't be specific about which newsrooms and who dropped it how, but it was basically, this is the kids, Trump still seems like something of a clown show, how relevant is this? And mostly that there's 15 other stories that were more likely to hit right away, and all of this reactive coverage. And that's why the New Yorker ends up breaking this, which was sitting there in open docs and with people who were communicating for nearly 2 years and through that election. I don't see many signs that these lessons have been learned. My perspective is glum at the moment, but I hope we're ready, and I hope that we're going to report and let the rest of it fall where it will. It's not actually our job to determine what happens with that reporting. It's to put the information out there in a clean and clear way, and so that it circulates. And what the public does with it from there, and what politicians do using us as their scene or their backdrop, is frankly outside of the scope of what I think we should be considering at the moment to do the fundamental job right.
You know, there's an old adage in journalism that you don't want to become the story. And I think in a lot of ways, Trump has successfully put the onus on reporters and made them the story. He's basically run against the press. They're the enemy of the people. My experience with reporters, a lot of them, particularly print reporters, is they're not always comfortable being in that role. Who would be? And I think in some respects that enables him to get away with a lot. And to the point that everyone's making about reacting and really overreacting to everything he says and does, kind of feeds that. And I think that journalists have to be very careful about falling into that trap. He kind of puts them into the spotlight, a place they're not comfortable being, making them part of the people he's fighting against. And reporters, like anybody would, get distracted by that. The country's following that narrative, they follow it too. So in terms of 2020, I just hope that to a certain extent, that is avoided a little bit more than it was in 2016. He basically ripped up the playbook, right, in 2016. I mean, no one has ever gone from the boardroom to the presidency. It's just never happened before. He was a completely out of character person to run for and win the presidency. And I think it threw everybody for a loop. And I just hope that the lessons are learned and that this time around people can kind of keep their eye on the ball and focus.
Ruby, you talked a little bit ago about the Democratic candidates. When I was invited, and maybe all of you were invited earlier this summer to be here, we had 24 Democrats running. Now we are down to a measly 20. Are you surprised there are so many Democrats still in the race at this point?
No. I mean, but functionally, there aren't 20 really running to try to be the Democratic nominee, right? Like, we have a race in which, again, the sitting president has gone from the boardroom to the White House. We've never had that before. And most national level Democrats looked themselves in the mirror probably a year or two ago and said, why not me? Why couldn't I win? Most of them were men who had that thought when looking in the mirror, I want to note. But,
Very true.
Thank you, Eric Swalwell. But no, I mean, I think that you're going to start to see that race winnow really, really quickly in the next couple months. The Democratic National Committee, the main arm of the party that runs the nominating process every 4 years, has, with some controversy, created some pretty stringent rules around who can and cannot participate in the debates, and you have to, reach a certain average of polling and get a certain number of donors. And I think by the time that the fall debates roll around, we're going to see that happen less and less. But it is a real challenge to cover such a big field. I mean, it's like really overwhelming in all the ways that you would expect, because in any given week in Iowa, there are like 10 different candidates, and you barely know where to go and who to see and what to do. And it just, it's sort of, it seems to be it's in a way, it's like the natural extension of the 2016 election. It's like, of course, we've got Trump on one end and then 24 Democrats on the other. It's just like, it's kind of a mess. So no, I'm not surprised, I guess.
2016, of course, was contentious, but we've seen other dramatic elections across the board, from George W. Bush and Al Gore in 2000 to Melinda Katz and Tiffany Caban in the Queen's DA contest this summer. Is the press caught up in horse race fever, or are we just keeping up with an audience that now seems to demand updates immediately?
I just took 2 weeks off of Twitter. I was at the beach. It was really nice. Sure, there's an audience who wants that, and I'm not on the business side of things happily, so that's not, my immediate concern is audience development, but there's a place and a role for horse race journalism. Politico many years ago, was sort of widely hit for that having allegedly metastasized and eaten up other sorts of coverage. It's important that there are people on the trail tracking what candidates are saying, seeing what the response to that is. Those are just obvious and simple measures of what's happening. If that's happening to the exclusion of other sorts of journalism, which I think it has to some extent, not a Politico, just broadly, that becomes a problem. But I think the focus on horse race journalism is in its own way a distraction. Like, people want to understand who's up and who's down and what that is potentially going to mean for them. Of course, and this is a TV problem, but not just a TV problem, I had to do a who won the day thing in 2008 with a colleague. And somebody had to win every day. And about 2 months out, I was like, Barack Obama is going to be the president, so he wins the day. And I'm like, no, because no one's going to read that. And that was a sort of obvious tension, and I actually resigned myself from the assignment. But understanding how a race is going is natural, is unavoidable. Half of newspapers traditionally are the sports section, and literally just that, like the statistical results given narrative form. We're not going to escape that. It just can't be in place of everything else. And as the industry has shrunk, that's been one of the cost-saving measures, in my view, is just focusing on that because it's easy and cheap to produce relatively.
Don't you guys think, though, there has been a genuine backlash to horse race journalism of campaigns that treat campaigns like a game? Like, I feel like people now are so, deadly serious about what's happening in this country and about the race. And yes, of course, many of those people are following every turn of the screw on Twitter. But I feel like there's now at least I'm seeing it a little bit more, certainly than in 2012 or 2016. There is a resistance to anything that treats politics like who's up, who's down, the game. There's a little bit more, because people want real, substantive stories, and I think that there is still more than anything, and maybe I hope more of there's a thirst for really, really good journalism that's well told, and I think people want less of this sort of like, I'm trying to think of a way to say this without talking about a certain outlet, but like, who's up, who's down is the best way to put it.
I do think there's an appetite for all of it, though, to a certain extent. I mean, I think that the good thing about Donald Trump, whatever side you fall on, is that there's a level of engagement that we really haven't seen in a very long time, at least in my lifetime. People are paying attention to politics, they're reading the coverage. There are people who want the horse race, who want the day-to-day, who thrive off that, who enjoy it. And I do think that a lot more is getting written about. I think there's a lot of journalism out there. I know the state of journalism is bad in the sense that many outlets are closing and laying people off. But with Twitter and everything else, there also are a lot of other opportunities where ordinary citizens and others are participating and writing and talking about this. And I do feel there is a level of engagement that is solid and bigger than it has been previously. And the cable news networks are thriving. They're doing better than they've ever done before because people are tuning in because they want to know, they want to hear that take. So I do think in some respects it has been a good thing for civic engagement.
Yeah, and I having been a part of Politico in the early days, I was part of this evolution around the 2008 election of covering the kind of incremental movement of politics, getting really into the granular, and there was clearly a niche audience, and there still is for that coverage. We saw the evolution in political journalism to also more explanatory journalism, places like Vox and 538. And I do think it's a big tent, and there is interest in all these types of journalism. Whether some of the kind of like insider-focused stuff maybe is seen as not really befitting of these times right now.
I want to remind everyone that if you have questions, go ahead and start making your way toward the microphone. I think we have 2 of them. If not, we'll just go with that one. But we'll keep going until we hear from you. But we do want to hear what you have to say. Every election has long shot candidates. They usually don't go far, but we remember catchy lines like the rent is too damn high. Locally, we saw Mayor Bill de Blasio easily win re-election. Governor Andrew Cuomo fought off a primary challenge and also won by a wide margin. Incumbents naturally get more coverage because they're already on the taxpayer dime. But when it comes to candidates like Cynthia Nixon, Mark Molinaro, and Nicole Malliotakis, did they get enough coverage?
I would argue they did. New York One is pretty good about that. We cover these things pretty thoroughly. I think that it's interesting what's happening in New York. I mean, and you mentioned the Tiffany Caban race. And I mean, the conventional wisdom in New York was always that low turnout elections favor the incumbents. And a lack of interest from the public will carry the incumbent and the favored candidate over the finish line. That's now completely reversed and turned on its head. And now you have, in a situation with Andrew Cuomo, for example, in 2018, he very wisely boosted turnout in the primary, and the more people who voted actually wound up voting for him and not his opponent. Had that been a low turnout election like you saw in the Queens DA race, which was kind of an off-cycle election and very few people voted, you had a very motivated group of people on the progressive left that were organized by the Democratic Socialists of America and Working Families Party and others. And Tiffany Caban came very close to unseating Melinda Katz, who was the borough president of Queens. I mean, that is amazing. That never would have happened in a different era. And again, I go back to the Trump phenomenon to a certain extent. There is a level of wokeness and awareness of local politics in a way that there previously has not been. So yes, most people who have a bandwidth for politics are following the crazy thing Trump said today. But you've seen it locally that people are saying, oh, hang on a second, I should be engaged in what's happening in my backyard as well. And they're taking an interest and they're actually voting, and that's a great thing.
It's interesting, right? Because you've had 2 different Trump-related phenomena. You've had people who've gotten really addicted to covering national politics and its twists and turns. Some of that can be horse race stuff, some of it was Russia involved. There were these narratives that you could hold on to, and people got a little addicted to that coverage. You've been following other things previously. It's all content competes with all content. And then farther on the left, mostly, at this point, you've had people who got very interested in engaging locally and in races like with AOC and with Caban early on, and New York One is always exemplary with these things, that did not get a ton of attention, and then started getting attention from very ideological outlets like the Intercept's political bureau that is very close to playing for a team, and then doing exceptionally well as people said, what can I do? And it wasn't a question of marching or showing up for a day or tuning into more cable news or following this stuff on Twitter, but participating. And that really has upended a lot of the local political dynamics. Bill Barr, the, again, Attorney General, just gave a speech to the Fraternal Order of Police in New Orleans, where he spent a bunch of time sort of complaining about this, that you have these anti-law prosecutors, he said, who are winning because of these low turnout primaries. But they're not that low turnout because these new groups are picking up. And I'm hopeful that we're going to see sort of broader participation, not in the national stuff and in that race, but in these local races that actually can make a significant difference, and I think are a much healthier thing to engage in, that you can connect the characters and the decisions and the stakes to what's happening in your own lives in a way that is almost always a studio trick or a Spielberg effect when you try to do that nationally.
I think a lot of us here locally remember New York One was interviewing Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on the air live, I think, when the news came in she won. So that was definitely a race you guys were covering before some other folks. So we're going to see a good line out there. We're going to start with questions. And if you'd like, tell us your name, whether you work for a news organization, you're going to school, whatever you'd like to share. Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Vicki Zunich, and I freelance for a local weekly in Queens. I have a statement and a question attached to that. The statement is that when it comes to national political news, I'm more of a consumer than a journalist. And what I find really frustrating goes back to your discussion of horse race versus issues. In the last election, I searched almost every day. I'm very interested in national education policy. I could find nothing, zero, on the website of either campaign, in their mailings, or in the coverage. When I did find something about education, it always went to tropes. American students are doing terribly. When I read immigration coverage, there's a trope. Immigration reform. Well, how is it formed and how are they going to read it? Never a discussion. It's only just this little trope, immigration reform. And then we talk about caravans and we move on. So that's the statement. The question is, when you talk about horse race coverage versus issues coverage, isn't there a way to weave issues into the horse race coverage, number one? And number two, to what extent do you as reporters have any say at all in how much horse race versus issues coverage there is? And to what extent is that really dictated from above? Thank you.
You want to take that?
I mean, I think it depends on the outlet in terms of what their area of focus, whether it's more policy-based or more horse race-based. I mean, at Politico, there's as many reporters covering policy, really detailed policy, as there is covering politics or media like myself. So I think it can vary from place to place. And in terms of frustrations with focusing on issues, I think this goes back to one of the points we were discussing earlier about distraction. And leading up to the 2018 midterm elections, you did see this when Trump starts talking about caravans every day, that starts dominating the conversation. Even if news organizations and responsible news organizations are pushing back on some of the points he's making or holding him accountable for these things, there's still, this becomes a driving part of the conversation and gets away maybe from some of the issues about immigration that you think are more deserving to be covered. At the same time, I do feel like I was following some excellent journalists, who were at the border in the summer of 2018, and who were really trying to cover what was happening, and often under really difficult circumstances when there's buildings and facilities that you just literally are not allowed to get into. But I think journalists did shed a lot of light into what was happening on the southern border, and so I think you saw some great reporting there. I mean, as far as the policy, how much policy and how much horse race, I think you have to have some horse race coverage. This is an election, as Ruby was talking about, with the debates, have been an integral part of how Democrats have been running for office the past 4 or 5 months. While people like Bernie Sanders were always going to get into the debate because he would meet the polling threshold and the donation threshold, so many of these Democratic candidates, their entire apparatus was functioning to get into the debates, the first 2 debates, and some of them got locked out of the third debate. So I think in some ways we can't ignore polling because this is a huge part of the Democratic primary process, but I totally understand what you're saying. News organizations need to focus on the policy. I think formats can be a big thing. Debates oftentimes don't lend themselves to detailed discussions about policy because you have 1 minute and then the moderator's cutting you off to bring in somebody else. We saw a couple days ago, CNN had a 7-hour climate change series of town halls, which to me was some of the most substantive discussions about climate change and the climate crisis that I've ever seen on television. I think there are ways to think about formats that in cable news that maybe are not going to bring in big ratings, but could get into those types of discussions on a more sustained basis and a more serious basis.
The only thing I'll quickly say is I think the coverage of the Democratic primary has really taken policy as a huge part of the sort of day-to-day of what's happening in this campaign. I mean, look at the Elizabeth Warren campaign, right? She's made the release of her plans the centerpiece of how she's running for president. I mean, everybody who's covering that primary has written so many stories about her very detailed policy plans on name any issue. I mean, look at the coverage of the healthcare debate, right? We've probably, maybe in a way that's, I don't know, been to the detriment of the actual substance of the conversation, but we've covered like the minute differences on healthcare policy. Who wants what kind of Medicare for All plan, and what did Kamala Harris say about it last month, and what is she saying about it this month, and did she flip-flop again? But we're still talking about healthcare policy and what Democrats believe healthcare policy in this country should look like. So the primary itself has been pretty substantive, actually, in the way that it's been covered and focused on policy. Whether or not that holds in the general election, I think, is a question that remains open.
Yeah, I mean, the first debate, I mean, was healthcare specific to the point of being not that interesting. I mean, I really, to be honest, like I remember watching it and being like, okay, enough, you know? I mean, it was substantive in a way that I feel like in some respects we haven't had previously. Their debates were always about a gotcha moment or try to cover as much ground as you possibly can. I think in this primary, it's been very focused on policy and the minutia of policy.
Molly?
Hey. My name is Molly Stark-Dean, and I have been laid off 5 times, so I'm looking for my next newsroom. I work in audience development and social media. So I'm from Vermont, from a very small town of a little over 500 people. How can you cover small towns without it feeling insulting and pandering?
I mean, I think the basic thing is to have people in those towns and either from the communities or you know, with experience in the communities covering them. Now there is a crisis in local news in this country, which I think most people know. We're trying to find a funding model, whether it needs to be a nonprofit model, whether it needs to be, you know, you do have companies like Patch, which have, you know, small sites in various different places. We just saw the closing a couple weeks ago of The Vindicator in Youngstown, Ohio. You know, you are seeing a nonprofit just is launching very soon in that community, but they're only launching with like 3 journalists as opposed to an entire newspaper. So I think in terms of covering, you know, small towns and small communities, the best thing is to have people who are, you know, well-versed in it rather than, you know, it's great if the New York Times sends someone there for a couple days, but then if you never write about that community again, it's not being particularly well served on a sustained basis.
And there are ways to do it well as a national reporter. One of the ways to not do it well is to do the like parachute a national reporter into some like Rust Belt town in the Midwest and have them go to a diner, talk to 3 people and be like, Joe Bob in such and such diner thinks that Trump's not so bad. Like, that sucks. That's bad journalism. But there's a way that, I mean, national reporters are capable of doing really well done, thorough work in which they come into a community, immerse themselves, try to understand it, do it better. I do think, though, that like we need to hire more people. We need more infrastructure for that kind of journalism, whether it's local or whether it's national papers relying on those local resources.
I think it would behoove the few places like the Times that are still doing reasonably well on the business side to, one, report stories that are actually local and are big enough to have a national audience, right? But not, are not, how do you feel about Trump in this diner? To do that, I think that they could very easily work with and co-byline with local reporters who have wealth of information already and have often raised these stories to the point where they're of awareness to Times reporters who will bring them to the attention of editors and, oh, that is interesting. And given what a winner-take-all journalism climate we're in, I think it would be very smart of the national outlets, not to pick on the Times, to do that generally and to really start not just crediting, but working with and paying some of those local reporters when they're working on stories there. And I think they would end up with a much more credible process. Otherwise, I think it's almost impossible because you just have scalability issues. And what's important in a town of 500 that has some national resonance is going to get bent when you're telling it just as a national story.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just want to ask you quickly, by the way, as of right now, we have 2 elected officials, one from New York and one from New Jersey, who are running for the Democratic nomination for president. Of course, Kirsten Gillibrand dropped out a few days ago. Current commander-in-chief was born and raised here in New York City. So for many of us, to paraphrase, all political coverage is local. And with such a local influence right now, does it change how any of you or your organizations report on the race for the White House?
Well, we had, I mean, New York One does local news primarily, but we had a budget to actually travel with de Blasio for that reason. So we did a lot of those early trips. I mean, he finally this week acknowledged what we were all thinking, which is that it's going to be very difficult for him to continue if he doesn't get into the next debate. He kind of did it, quietly, was under the radar a little bit, but no, we were following him. He is our mayor. It is absolutely relevant, and he does have a good record to run on. It just seemed like the local press corps was never going to allow him to catch fire, and he certainly didn't. And I don't know how long that will continue, this race, but we definitely tried to. That's something we probably would not have done had it not been the mayor. Or for a long time, honestly, we thought Andrew Cuomo would be the person we'd be following. We thought he was going to get into the race, and then that kind of got turned around, and it became de Blasio and not Cuomo. So that was a different take for us. I don't know that we covered it more thoroughly when it was Trump and Hillary Clinton, even though they were both had New York roots or had ties to New York. The mayor was a little bit different.
Good morning. Hi.
Daniela Vivar, student at La Guardia Community College. How do you think journalism should approach minorities to get involved in the election when we fear for our life and we have a president who is threatening all the time in the news?
Sorry, a little trouble. Could you just say that one more time, please?
How do you think journalism should approach minorities when they are fair to speak in this moment?
How should journalism approach minorities in this moment?
For the election, to get them involved, to vote, to get to know the people who are running.
I think one really important thing is to increase newsroom diversity. We have to do a better job of getting more women, more minority reporters into newsrooms. We have to.
Language skills, it's incredible how few, like just Spanish speaking, and then get into a host of other languages, how few reporters have language skills, and it cuts you off not having them, as well as cultural knowledge and a diverse in many different senses newsrooms from reporting and addressing a tremendous amount of stories. I think that's central.
Thank you. Good morning.
Hi, my name is Daniela Sertori. I'm a master's student in business and economic reporting at NYU. And my question is based on something that Ruby said, how overwhelming it can be to cover such a big field of candidates. So I was wondering what all of your process is to actually decide who to cover and how much coverage to give them without completely ignoring some other candidates that might deserve the attention as well.
I'm in a newsroom where we have a team of folks covering 2020, maybe 5 or 6, I think, maybe a little bigger, 6 or 7. Like, we have someone who reports on climate change. We have someone who reports on immigration, and then the rest of us are kind of split among candidates. We have one reporter who's covering, and these were sort of arbitrary assignments, to be totally honest with you. We have someone who's covering Biden and Buttigieg. I cover mostly Bernie and Warren, but also do a bunch of other things. And then we have someone who's covering Beto and Kamala. And so I think we kind of just randomly divided it up. And then we have other people who have done some of the lesser known candidates. And but yeah, I think that if you ask any, it's so funny because when I see other reporters on the trail, we kind of always joke about how we're all sort of just like figuring this out as we go. And I don't mean that in a sort of like irresponsible, bad way. I just mean that's kind of all that you can do. We're all just trying to figure it out as we go and do the best job that we can and write the best stories that we can and cover this crazy primary.
Has Yang not gotten the coverage that
That's
he
a good
deserves?
question.
He says he hasn't.
Right.
And I think he makes a fair point if you're looking at polling. And you're looking at where he's polled, but also the social media interest in his campaign, which we have seen is higher than other more traditional candidates that are getting more, I think, traditional media coverage. I mean, that's one of the points he's making. Bernie Sanders' campaign has been probably the most critical of any campaign against the news media, suggesting that Bernie Sanders' campaign is being written off by a lot of news organizations. So there has been a frustration with the Democrats. I mean, the news. We've never had a situation where there's 24 candidates running in a primary. And one of the things I noticed early on when I talked with executives about how they were deploying resources is there was a real concern about making mistakes that were made in 2016, which is initially we're going to write somebody off. A lot of news organizations wrote off the idea that Donald Trump could ever be president. And he didn't have a big press corps. There was a bigger press corps for Jeb Bush at the beginning of 2016 than there was for Donald Trump. And I think a lot of news organizations didn't want to make that mistake. Hey, who knows, maybe Andrew Yang would catch fire and could jump in this thing. At the same time, you have to be, most places have limited resources. You can't have 24 beat reporters, as well as covering specific issues coverage, policy coverage. So I think you have to make these determinations looking at polls, looking at where the candidates are. But it is something where there's always going to be a situation like with Andrew Yang that he may point out that he's doing better in certain metrics, especially online, especially in social media. He's gotten the donations. He's been in the debates. He's going to be in the third debate now. Other candidates who may have gotten more attention, who hold elected office, are not in that debate because there's just not as much grassroots interest in them. So I think there is this push and pull, and it's fair for candidates to say, we don't think you're covering us enough, and news organizations should look closely and see if they are doing it.
And every candidate has had that complaint so far, from the top of the polls to the bottom. Trust me.
We are all about giving everybody a chance to say what's on their mind, so let's, good morning.
Good morning. My name is Nancy Bown. I'm a student at the College of New Jersey. So in connection to what we were discussing about how social media is making people more interested in the news and following the elections, how would you suggest picking stories, whether or not, like, of course, there's the business side and then there's the moral side, but are we choosing stories, are we catering to what people want to read, or how we should be approaching the news in an ethical way? Like, of course, there's like sensationalism news. Like, how can we, like, especially for young adults, like, get them involved in news that's like pure, I guess. Thank you.
So I guess the question is making it important, covering what's important, but also covering what's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to write and present journalism that people want to watch and want to read. I really do. I think that there's also you want to be substantive, you want to have things that matter and are important, but who are we also to make that determination? You don't want to be pedagogical also. You don't want to lecture people about this is what you should pay attention to or should care about. So it's a balance. It's tough. I mean, you don't want to play up every gaffe or every silly thing that Trump says, but there is that also has to be covered. People do want to know that stuff, and I think there's a place for it also.
There was a point at which Pete Buttigieg, when he was first in the race, was doing tons of media. If you guys remember, he was taking every interview basically, and it was part of what helped him rise to the top of the polls. But his press person and his senior strategist, Liz Smith, said something that I think kind of applies to journalism as well. She basically said, people are criticizing us for talking to TMZ as if it's like below the process of running for president. Why wouldn't we talk to TMZ? There are real people out, like smart human beings out there in the world who love TMZ, who read TMZ every day. Why wouldn't we talk to them? We're not trying to insult them by saying like, we're too good to talk to you. And I think the same is kind of true from the perspective of a reporter. Things can be substantive, things can be interesting, you can do it all. There's nothing wrong with that.
All right. Good morning.
Hello. Hey, good morning. My name is Larissa Rinaldi. I'm from Brazil. So I know that the United States is very huge influence for the rest of the world. So I want to ask, how do you think American press covering the elections of 2020 can influence other countries' media in the next election, such as Brazil in 2022? And how did the 2016 coverage help to elect Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil? I mean, it's not just about him, but there are a lot of other countries, like in Europe and all those things, with extremely right presidents. So, extremely right.
Are they reading the Daily News in Rio, Harry?
I hope so. I hope so. It's very hard to separate cause and effect at any given time and signal from noise. So while Andrew Yang is complaining about being at 2% in the polls, right? Every newsroom in the United States in like 2012 and 2014 was dumping money into like some sort of predictive stuff that involved social sentiment. And I was around a bunch of these in different capacities and watched this. And what they all said, actually, was that in different years, starting in the Ron and then Rand Paul was definitely going to be president. So what all these places did was they just quietly corrected that and put out data that pretended that that wasn't the case because they thought that was ridiculous, and then the rest of it more or less as it was shaped. I think because Donald Trump was elected president, and this was a stunning moment for many people, and because we have this very large, we're a very large country and there's a very large press, this gets treated as though he was raising the ocean. I think very obviously there were elections all around the world in different places and shifts in Turkey beforehand, in Israel, in Brazil, in Eastern Europe, that this was happening. And so I think we don't actually deserve often that much credit. Zach was saying earlier that the New York press wouldn't allow de Blasio to rise up. I'd like to think that's true. Go us. We had that ability, and it helped. I think that we have a very important and fundamentally, in certain ways, passive role. That like the press can't decide who wins. When it tries to, it has really weird feedback effects that tend to be very negative for the press and the broader society. And that it's just a question of doing this sort of essential work and then observing the world rather than attempting to shape it. So not guilty.
Okay. So sorry, but so how can we train journalists to make people think, I guess?
Money helps a lot. I'm not being sarcastic. There used to be in America one journalist for every PR person. It's now about 5 to 1, and the PR people make about twice as much money, right? I don't understand how to fix the finances of all this, the nonprofit models, or Phil Murphy, the governor of New Jersey, is like, here's money for little news operations. People are thinking about all sorts of different stuff, but the economics of this are pretty fundamentally broken, and it creates all sorts of rot where simple information is not reported. There aren't enough people filing FOIAs, like Freedom of Information Acts, that just produce new information that's nominally public but no one will see otherwise, and dealing with this stuff, which can be very boring but is very important work, right? If you have more money, more people doing this, and you're incentivizing better people, like I read a column in New York. I think I'm a good columnist in New York, mostly because the people who would write much better columns, or more talented writers and smarter than me and know more stuff, are writing like Marvel sequels at best, or bad Netflix shows, and it really drains the number of people who are engaged. I'm sorry, that's a grouchy answer, but I think money would help tremendously, and past that, people being involved locally, and that's where you start to work these tools out, gain a sense of engagement, and where journalists actually emerge from, I think, in the best and most healthy way, as opposed to, I'm going to Charlie code and crack the conspiracy about how Donald Trump won the election, say.
And to your original question, I do think there is something going on globally. And I do think Trump and Brexit and your example, Brazil, I mean, there has been a backlash, and we're watching this happen really all around the world, to sort of conventional wisdom and what some people perceive as elitism, and telling people how things are and how they're supposed to be, and people kind of rising up and saying, no, that's not what I want, or I'm not going to do it that way. And that's kind of a moment in time that we're in, and it's very interesting.
Well, I feel winning, and I'm starting to look at the clock. I'm not going to bump Jane Tillman Irving, I promise you that. So let's get to more of our speakers. But first, good morning.
Good morning. My question has to do with, well, first of all, my name is Alicia Vinter. I go to St. John's University, but I'm from Kentucky. And my question has to do with how there's still so many voters and so many people who stick to one fact or one story, like you mentioned Hillary, and the first thing that pops in people's minds is the emails. Or Obama, you have like the whole thing with why hasn't he released his birth certificate? And my question has to do with, how do you make individuals take their minds, like how do journalists draw their minds away from those like statements and get to more like unbiased views on candidates running or just news in general?
I don't necessarily know if that's the job in the moment of interviewing someone, right? Like of a journalist. I was in South Carolina recently for some 2020 event, and I was talking to this guy who said he was a Joe Biden supporter. Joe Biden's leading by a large margin in the polls there. It's still early, so it doesn't matter, but he is. And I said, so why do you like Joe Biden? He said, I don't know, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I got to think about it. But he just did. And sometimes it's as simple as that, right? Like, I totally agree with you. There were millions of people who, when they heard the name Hillary Clinton, they were like, emails, liar, whatever, like.
Yeah, they don't actually have like facts about that. Like, a lot of people don't actually know what's in the emails. They just know the emails are bad.
But that's why I think political journalism is such a human story, because this is a weird, sometimes nonsensical, sometimes biased, sometimes sexist, sometimes homophobic, sometimes racist, sometimes process where the views of the American people do come out. And it's not a journalist's job to try to change. You can prod and say, well, why do you really think that? Like, what is it about the emails that bothers you so much? What did she really do wrong, in your opinion? You can prod them, but you're not trying to change their minds. I mean, that election, the 2016 election, was as valuable a snapshot of America today as we could have ever gotten. And that doesn't mean it was a good snapshot, but it was a real one, right?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning. My name is April Cardena. I am a student at LaGuardia Community College. I am also the founding partner of Premier Strategies, which is a New York-based political consulting firm. So personally, I've worked on multiple campaigns, both on the Republican and Democratic side. And so my question, I guess, is a really good follow-up question to that, is this epidemic of fake news. You know, in both sides, they both complain about it. You know, they reported this incorrectly. So how do you personally go and report without igniting, or do you attempt to report without igniting the confirmation bias within certain populations? Or do you just go in stating the facts, and is your job just to state that and see how people react? And additionally to that, do you feel it is your moral or ethical job as a journalist to simply report as it is, regardless of your personal stance or your personal beliefs on a political candidate?
I'm an opinion columnist, so I edit opinion, so I have some space there. I edit very reported opinion. I try to write it. Look, the whole phrase "fake news" is a disaster. It's a perfectly arch phrase, like counterfeit detection. The more you talk about that, the more ridiculous everything becomes, and the harder it is to get to which underlying facts are true, which goes indeed to the previous question about fixation on just the emails or whatever. If you continue to put out new and reported information and to explain what that information means through your own voice, to people you're quoting, through framing, in a healthy and credible way, that's a useful thing to do. What's interesting is none of this or these tensions are new at all. Like, people constantly, complain about the journalists, the umpires, the refs, everyone else, and this isn't fair. And I'm at 2%, we get 10% more coverage. If you just keep putting out information and do not allow yourself to become the story, and continue with that work, you end up in a healthier place. But this is not a new conversation. This isn't something that was pioneered by Donald Trump or Newt Gingrich before him. And they're very old concerns. I don't think the answers have changed either. I think because the news business is collapsing a bit and we're having bigger social shifts, that there's been a bit of a panic about that and an attempt to find new answers. This seems ridiculous. There's one thing to do, and it's to report the news.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that some of these concerns have been around. Spiro Agnew was talking about this 50 years ago in Des Moines this year. And you saw in Republican elections, especially talking about bias, but I do feel like Trump has amplified this critique of the media and taken it to a new level where it's not, the media has cultural bias or political bias because they're based in New York or in Washington, but that the media is fundamentally anti-American. The media is fabricating information on a daily basis, creating sources, that it's different than they have a spin on it or they come from a biased place but are completely making things up. So I think the best thing you can do is report information. I think the news media can do more in terms of transparency and talking about their processes. Most people don't understand when they see an anonymous source. People in this room would because you're in the business, but most people don't understand the reporter knows who that source is, and they've talked to them, and they know what their name is, and their editor knows. And just opening up the process, I think, can help in terms of transparency. I do think there's also a segment of the population, especially diehard Trump supporters perhaps, that are just not going to believe what's in the New York Times or in the Washington Post. And going back to the question about emails or how do you get, there's a feedback loop, there's an information or misinformation ecosystem that is churning constantly where you can get all of your information from some sources, and you could read every day stories about Hillary Clinton's emails, now in September of 2019, and you probably could, indefinitely, if that's what you choose your information ecosystem to be. And so news organizations, responsible places can only do so much.
Thank you very much. The president of the New York Press Club, Jane Tillman Irving.
Well, thank you very much. Jane Tillman Irving, president of the New York Press Club, recently retired from WCBS News 880. If we learned anything about America in 2016 and beyond, as if we didn't know, we learned that racism sells. And because cities are full of, it is assumed, people who look like me, we get very little coverage of cities. Cities are where the culture is, where the money is. I'm not talking about you, Zach, in your coverage. But also infrastructure is a vast topic that that is talked around. But if we look at Flint, we look at Newark, and soon, and the New York City subway system, et cetera. Why is there no coverage of cities? We went through an entire cycle in 2016, never mentioned cities, and very little has been mentioned about cities at this time. Why is that, other than that racism sells?
I have one thought there. I think that's a great question. I think it has to do with why de Blasio has had such a tough time getting traction, where Pete Buttigieg can explode. I think this has something to do with the Electoral College, and that there are many, many more spoiled votes. Yeah. And racism, particularly for Republicans, also plays a role there. But let's put that aside for a minute. That there are many, many more spoiled votes in cities, and that there's not actually a call for a national urban leader in a way I think there would be in a system configured somewhat differently. And I think also because infrastructure in particular is so important and is complicated and a little boring, to turn into a sexy or dramatic story, or to have characters. Even with Trump and Infrastructure Week, it's tough. And that's just a gag phrase. These incredibly important issues don't play out. Finally, this election in particular, I think, is really going to be decided in suburbs. I guess, what do I know? May well be decided in suburbs, but because we think about cities as separate from the larger metro areas, and because those larger metro areas are often used as a de facto way to segregate schools and housing and other things, that flaw in I think the media and most people's conversational models further distorts and makes it more difficult to have that conversation. And because we have those splits, of course, there's different leaders. So now you're talking about the Nassau County exec, and now you're talking about the New York City mayor, and it's like, how does that come together? And then people start snoozing. So, I mean, that's my sense, but I think it's a great question. It's something worth working on fixing.
Thank you. Good morning.
Hello. Earlier you discussed consideration on the part of the press that they had perhaps not shown Donald Trump enough initial attention on the assumption that he wasn't going to win. And then you discussed that this reconsideration had an effect in terms of how much coverage alternative Democratic candidates like Andrew Yang get. I was wondering whether or not you thought that the coverage of Republican candidates who are proposing to challenge Donald Trump in the primary is sufficient.
What about how much they're being covered now?
Yes.
I mean, I think there is interest in the press for Republicans' critiques of the president. And so you see someone like Joe Walsh, no matter all the sorts of ridiculous things, and he admits racist things that he has said in the past. Now he has kind of turned a corner and is running. Because there is no viable primary right now on the Republican side. And Donald Trump has, upper 80s, 90% favorability among Republicans, it seems, extremely difficult that he would, but almost anyone running for president can get on TV. And you see this on the Democratic side. People who can't even poll to get into the debates, even the first debate, can still get on TV. I think that creates an incentive for people to run for president, even if they don't have much of a chance. And I think there is some interest in whether there's a Republican or right-leaning critique of Trump, and if there's any sort of movement there. And so people like Joe Walsh is going to get some airtime right now. I think if he shows that he doesn't have any real support, it probably would not last long.
Might also know that Governor Bill Weld of Massachusetts is also seeking the Republican nomination. Thank you very much. Good morning.
Hello, my name is Sivan E, and I'm a student at the Newmark J School at CUNY. And this is a hot point of conversation in my particular classroom and during our orientation, the use of incendiary language, in particular the term racist and racism when it comes to a candidate. How do you cover that, and how do you address that when it comes to this upcoming election?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to a candidate, which sounds like that's such a weird thing to say, but I didn't mean it in that way. I just meant one of the candidates running for president was talking about this, and they were saying, I want to have a substantive, nuanced conversation about race in this country. That's what I want to do. And you guys, meaning the political press, are asking me, well, do you think Donald Trump's a racist? Well, do you think he has racism in his heart? Well, okay, but do you think he's a white supremacist? He's like, I want to have a real conversation about this, but all you guys care about is what label I'm willing to attach to him. And it's dumbing down the conversation. This is what he said to me. And I hadn't thought about it in that way, but having been on the road and seeing candidates kind of get approached by gaggles of reporters and TV cameras and be like, well, do you think Donald Trump is this? Do you think he's that? It does kind of limit the ability to actually have that fuller, more nuanced conversation. So I don't think the labels are insignificant. I think it does matter who's willing to call out words and actions under certain terms. But I think we also need to work really, really hard and harder, do a better job than we're doing now of trying to have a fuller conversation about what we really mean when we're asking candidates, do you think Donald Trump is X, Y, Z?
Harry, writing down some notes there.
It's incendiary language as a thing, right? So Beto O'Rourke right now is really into saying fucking when he's talking about how we need to do something about guns. And that is purposeful. It was purposeful the first time, it's been purposeful since, and they're selling, it's part of his attempt to build support. Those are two very different words, obviously, but this is all amped to 11 stuff. And the idea that you're going to win by continuing to do that, or just putting that into more headlines and coverage, I think is a huge tactical mistake. And someone else goes to 12, and then 15, and eventually we all do this. I wrote early in 2015 about my view that Donald Trump is a racist, which I've held for many years, or 16. And before this, the press had a big argument about it. I'm an opinion columnist. I think the idea that if you just put that word, decorative words, into your news coverage, that this is going to improve things is absurd. And it takes all the convincible people who are elsewhere, and it does. It creates this boiling down, like with the candidate was saying about the racism conversation, where, if I support Trump, then I'm a racist. I don't think I'm a racist. Screw you. And everything else people say or think immediately goes out the window, and you're back into deplorables territory and all that stuff. And it really becomes, even though he is one, it seems fairly clear to me, and some of the things he says plainly are, just a useless and wasteful conversation, much like the fake news one.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Sheila Katzman. I'm a retired UN professional, public information. I'm going to throw the first question that was asked by the moderator. Are you prepared for the 2020 elections? Write that down. And I asked the question because I think it's Ruby that mentioned that, okay, this one is covering climate change, this one is doing this one is doing this, and then we just do every little thing. I was the chief of public information and spokesperson for one of the world's largest peacekeeping missions some years ago. And my job with over 102 staff members was to make sure that my staff was well trained to cover elections. Each time there is an election, we need to be retrained. So it goes back to that question, are you ready? And if you're not ready, what demands are you making on your media houses to make sure you're retrained? Because, you know, it's okay to put a tweet out there, but what's behind those tweets? We need good investigative journalism too. Those tweets are not just tweets. They mean something, and people want to know, and I think that it's our job, our responsibilities as journalists to make sure we get behind those tweets and give people the information so that they can make informed decisions, whether in cities or in villages or in towns. Thank you.
Any thoughts, panel?
I love some good training. Seriously, you know, I started doing journalism and they threw me in and I learned a bunch of stuff and I learned some other stuff. There's been very little in the way of formal training. I'm very grateful for what I've had, and I try to spread that in the newsrooms I'm in and like steal younger people who are not actually under my watch and like give some of it to them when I can. But it's something that it's an important enough business I think we could all use. I think there's not that much of it that I know of before people take on these sorts of assignments necessarily.
Thank you.
Right, and I think hiring, you know, journalism students and others, the newsroom should do this to help with the 2020 elections, because you're all going to be surprised, all of us.
Yeah. Well, one thing I'm not surprised about is there are journalism students here today, and I'm looking forward to meeting them. So thank you, and good morning.
Good morning. My name is Aisha Khalja. I'm a journalism student myself at Burke College, and I'm also the business editor of my school's newspaper, The Ticker. I have a question. You said that the audience engagement obviously increased after the Trump election or in the past few years. And how do you think that this reporting, not just the engagement, but also the reporting of the elections transformed with the engagement of the community? And for this, I'm going to give an example. Like when you were in school or when you just started covering these topics, politics, or maybe you were covering arts before, how do you think what you learned changed to what you do today? And I also want to relate this to how media is seen in the United States today. We were talking about other countries' elections. And I've worked in a newsroom in Turkey this summer, and I attempted to cover the famous mayor re-elections in Turkey, and it was not a very good experience, I would like to say. And I've seen people very outraged about the media once I went to rooms that were totally free to take photos of, and people were very angry. People were prejudiced with a person who had a media pass or didn't have a media organization behind them. And do you think that with the recent outrage for media in the United States increasing, do you think that it's going to affect your reporting or your headlines in the future as well?
Maybe we start with that last part. Do you have concerns about people who may not be fans of journalists these days? Does it impact at all how you cover the news, how you go about your day?
I mean, you definitely think about it, right? Like, we all know right before we are about to publish a story that's going to very almost probably certainly outrage like a wing of the party or the Trump people or the you know, any number of people. You're kind of like, you kind of gird yourself. You're like, I know that there are going to be people attacking me on Twitter all day, and I think that women journalists and journalists of color get it in a way that is like particularly vicious online sometimes, depending on what the story is about. That's never fun. But I don't think it changes the work. I think it's just kind of part of the like ecosystem that we all work in now, which is kind of upsetting and sad, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, but it's really easy when apparently it's pretty easy to sit behind your computer and anonymously attack, and that's just part of the job now.
Yeah. One of the things that can be interesting sometimes is, I think you're totally right about the backlash you get on social media, and especially for women and people of color. And you know that anytime you write something, you get this instant reaction. I think sometimes we do see the kind of hate towards the media, and if you go to a Donald Trump rally, he'll marshal that, and the boos will rain down, and CNN sucks, and all these sorts of things. If you're at a Donald Trump rally, you may actually have some good interactions with people around you, and that's not just true at Trump rallies, but other places where candidates may be more critical to media. And writ large, you might get this hostility towards the news media, but one-on-one, you can have extremely different conversations than you do when supporters of that candidate are firing at you on Twitter immediately after you write something. So I think there is this tendency to see the media, quote unquote, as this monolith, as this other, as this person, this entity that we can attack, and that is fundamentally against us or against your way of life or against you. And you can, if you want to marshal hostility, as Donald Trump does towards the media, it's easy to do. I think in our day-to-day coverage, when we're out reporting, you're interacting with people, and so they may see you in a very different light than this kind of caricature that's portrayed about what the media is.
Sure, and I would like to add.
I apologize. We have 5 people behind you. I just want to keep things moving, but I appreciate your time. If you say it very quickly, just your last thought.
Sure. I forgot to say, when this news piece becomes a conversation, do you also find more courage to be bolder in your headlines, in your pieces, in your reporting?
Well, I think you can't. I think news organizations should not fear necessarily the perception that we're going to be seen in a certain way. I think you just have to go about your business thinking about the fundamentals and being direct and clear with what you want to get across, rather than fearing if we write a headline this way, it may be perceived by a certain segment of the population and be critical. I think you just go with your gut and what you feel is most accurate and most fair, and is the best possible coverage you can do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning.
Hi. My name's Koichi Shiryanagi. I worked at LinkedIn, and my temp contract had ended, so I'm looking for work, but I was at the LinkedIn editorial team. Anyway, my question is about the preparation for the 2020 election and the fact that elections, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion and coverage of candidates, but elections are about the voters, about the people who vote are really the real story. That an election and election results are like an aggregated public opinion kind of the country. And just going back to 2016, there are polls that can show estimates, guesstimates of public opinion, but like there isn't, the real poll that matters is on election day and the votes. And so, what I wanted to ask is, do you think that coverage of elections is too heavy kind of on the candidates and not enough is on the public, and kind of what is driving people to vote in the way that they're voting, kind of, in an aggregated way? And just to talk about one thing, we have
about 5 minutes.
Oh, okay.
Let's talk about that, on the trail versus talking to the voters.
Absolutely not. You can't cover every person in the country individually. It's difficult to cover communities. You have to have some political mechanism and some way to work this out in aggregate and on time intervals, and politics is our method for doing that. And so the idea that we're going to turn our attention away from the avatars of different groups and ideas and to all of the people behind them, I think would be an exhausting and dissipating effort. That is literally what politics in its broadest sense is built to do, is to collect broader and individual opinions and give us a way to understand them and personify them in certain ways. And also to diffuse that a little bit so that it's not just what everyone thinks at any given moment or in any poll. So I don't see any way of routing around that system, and I think that what we've seen in the last few years, and as social media has taken on a larger role in the news coverage, shows that when you move in that direction, that it tends to be very unhealthy and a lot of false information. And poisonous information gets into the mix more easily when you try to disrupt those systems.
And just quickly, to what Ruby was saying earlier, which is a good point also, there tends to be sometimes too much of that, of kind of dropping into the diner, and this is what the guy I happen to be sitting next to met, and we think that's somehow representative of an entire community or a state. We really can't necessarily get our hands around that, and it's not really doing anybody a great service to try in some respects.
Oh, for our remaining questioners, we'll just go right to the questions so we can get everybody through. Go ahead, please.
Sure thing. With Fios One News shutting down, how do you think this will affect the regional news network for those regions that currently have them? And how would it affect the viewers?
My understanding is that RNN's arrangement with Verizon is going to transfer to News 12 so that there will be, the void that is left by Fios One will be picked up by News 12. I haven't seen the template. I don't know if they're going to expand or use current resources. I was discouraged to hear that it was ending, and then I was encouraged to see that Altice, or whatever company owns them now, is going to actually pick up some of the slack there. So we'll see. I hope so.
Thank you.
So behind every article, you have the writer with their own personal biases, and sometimes that can come through the piece. For example, saying argue or saying complain instead of argue. When referencing a quote, or for example. So how do you think that consumers can look at news in a more critical way and be able to separate the actual facts and the news and the information from the own person's bias?
Look for people who use says a lot. Anytime someone is speaking, read different sources that are putting out different information, see what tracks. If something grabs you, just take that quote and throw it into Google and see who else is using it. And just be an intelligent and curious person who wants to sort out the information from the rest. And a lot of that is just sort of taking the time to chew and digest, so you're not just swallowing everything at once and then trying to deal with it. And then find journalists and outlets that are doing that consistently and you think are providing good information, and continue to follow them. Every now and again, spot check. See what places are really critical of those places, if they might be onto something, and then just continue reading, being interested.
Thank you. Good morning.
Hi. My question is about headlines. I find myself scrolling through my Apple News app a lot, and just notice that a CNN headline is going to say so-and-so senator (parentheses R) involved in scandal. The Fox headline is going to say so-and-so Senator D involved in scandal. When you actually open the articles, I find most of the time that it's a great article. It's fair. So I guess my question is how much thought goes into those headlines? Because I do find them polarizing. So is it just I just need a jazzy headline to catch a reader's attention, or I guess does more thought go into it?
I mean, at the end of the day, all of these media companies are companies, and they have a profit motive, and they want to build audience and readers. And we can all lament that that's the state of journalism, and that's wrong, and journalism should be pure. But look, the press is free for those who own it. I mean, that's just the business model. And sure, there's a level of sensationalism with headlines to try and draw people in, and we can all say that that's bad, and I think you're right to some degree that is, but that is unfortunately part of what comes with it, and good journalism will sometimes be attached to sensational headlines.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much to Harry Siegel, Michael Calderon, Ruby Kramer, and Zach Fink.